Thank you so much, Michelle. It is unfortunate, but it is nevertheless true that there are idiots in this world. Yes, I hear some applause. That might have been one of our idiots. I'm not sure. Anyway. All right, not only are there idiots in this world, and that's a true statement and unfortunate, it's also true and equally unfortunate that some of these idiots make their way into church, and churches have idiots. And so we have them, every church has got them. You may be that one, they may be seated with you, you may be married to them, I don't know, but there's idiots all around us. This was very clearly demonstrated to me back early in my childhood. The church that we were at through about the 5th grade, it was a little small church, and they had something that I'm sure most churches back in the day used to have. Every Sunday before Sunday school, they would have assembly. You remember assembly? And with this, everybody would meet before Sunday school in the sanctuary. And it was for about 12, 15 minutes or so, and there would be a song everybody would sing, and then there would be a lay person that would give the devotional, which was kind of strange. It's like you had a little Bible study before you had a longer Bible study, and then you had a sermon. But anyway, that's just kind of what we did. Now, this particular church, it was a small building, and in the middle of the building was the sanctuary. On either side, there was the A wing and the B wing, and on the sides of the sanctuary, there were doors that would lead to those wings. And on this particular Sunday, as it was in virtually every Sunday, a layperson would give the devotional. On this particular Sunday, though, there was a guy at our church whose name was Bob. Bob was a nice guy. He was, at that point, about my age now. He had, as I recall, 3 children. Really nice guy, but he was a little bit different. But, that's how Yankees are. And so... That one was free. Anyway, Bob gets up to do the devotional, and he steps to the pulpit, and he has literally just said a few words, hardly even finished a complete sentence. And midway in his sentence, somebody comes from the door on the left, somebody comes from the door on the right, and they yell, "Fire." Well, they're saying, "Fire, fire, there's a fire over here," and all of a sudden people began to get up, and some of the men ran toward those wings to see if they could figure out what was going on. Others are making their way out of the back door. I'm standing up with my family. We're heading out, and as all this commotion, all this chaos is all of a sudden going on, Bob is up at the pulpit, and he is trying to say, "It's okay, everyone, there's not actually a fire. It's an illustration. It's an illustration, and people can't hear, and folks are still going out." It was absolute chaos, and finally, in the midst of this chaos, word kind of gets around. People understand, okay, there's not actually a real fire. Everyone makes it back into the sanctuary. They get seated, and you can just imagine how well that went. There are idiots in church. But as Bob was trying to settle all this down, one of the things that he did was to say very simply this: when someone yells fire, it gets your attention. And you can know that it gets your attention because you actually do something. You get up and leave. You go call 911. You go investigate and try to smother or to attack the fire. Someone yelling fire gets your attention because you do something. Well, Bob might have been an idiot, but even broken clocks are right twice a day. And there was something that he said that was true, which again is, you can tell when something has your attention because of what you do. For the past couple of weeks, we've been working our way through the little book of Jonah. And the first thing that we noted was that it was a burden that God put on Jonah's heart that he do something. Jonah decides, I'm not going to do that. I want to do things my way. I want to do my own thing. And he winds up running from God. He's not paying attention to God. He's got his fingers in his ears. Is not giving God any attention whatsoever. And we talked about last week that God's not indifferent to that. And what he will do then is to work through circumstances, virtually limitless circumstances, to try to get our attention. And all that leads us to the question today, which very simply is this: how do we know then when God has our attention? If you have found yourself or find yourself like a Jonah and you're doing your own thing and you're running not to God but away from God, when He works through circumstances to get your attention, how do you know that He's got it? How do you know this morning that God has your attention? Well, we see the answer to that question today in Jonah chapter 2. If you would look with me in your Bibles there today, Jonah chapter 2, starting with verse 1. Jonah chapter 2, starting with verse 1. Chapter 1 ends with Jonah in the belly of this great fish, and in verse 1 of chapter 2, we're told Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the fish's belly, and he said, I cried out to the Lord because of my affliction, and He answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. You cast me into the deep, into the hearts of the sea, and the flood surrounded me, and your billows and your waves passed over me. Then I said, I have been cast out of your sight, yet I will look toward your holy temple. The waters surrounded me, even to my soul. The deep closed around me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. I went down to the moorings of the mountains. The earth with its bars closed behind me forever. Yet you have brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. When my soul fainted within me, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer went up to you in your holy temple. Those who regard worthless idols forsake their own mercy, but I will sacrifice to you with the voice of thanksgiving. I will pay what I have vowed. Salvation is of the Lord. We see an example here of someone that is now paying attention to God. God has Jonah's attention, and we can tell not only that God has his attention, but based on this experience, how you can tell if God has your attention. And here's the first way. You realize what God has been doing. You can know that God has your attention when you realize what God has been doing. So that we're all on the same page, let's refresh and remember what it is that's been going on thus far. God told Jonah to do something very simple, to leave where he was, to head east and go to the city of Nineveh and preach there. Jonah decides, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to go to Nineveh. I don't want to preach to these people. I want to do my own thing. And so he ignores the command of God. He gets on a boat and heads the opposite direction. Instead of heading to modern-day Iraq, he was heading to modern-day Spain. And so he's on the run from God, paying no attention to Him. And we talked last week and we saw how God was not indifferent to this. And God caused this great storm to erupt, so much so that the professional sailors, these mariners who were manning the ship that Jonah was on, they anticipated that they were going to all die, that the storm was going to break the ship up. And you remember how ultimately what happened is that Jonah said, listen, all this is my fault. This has happened because I've been running from God. If you'll just throw me into the water, then the seas will calm, your lives will be spared. And so they said, okay, God, don't put innocent blood on our hands. He told us to do it. They throw Jonah into the sea. And as chapter 1 comes to a close, Jonah has not only found himself in the sea, now he has been swallowed by this great, enormous fish. Now, this great fish that verse 17 mentions, we can only reasonably surmise that it was some type of whale for a couple of reasons. One, it's got to be really big. The other thing is it needs to be an animal that's going to surface to get air so that Jonah also is able to get oxygen and breathe. But we need to say a little bit more about this great fish. Certainly those that are skeptics of the faith and skeptics with regard to the Bible, they would point to this story of Jonah in the belly of this fish for 3 days. They would say, see, that's just fairy tale. That's just imaginative nonsense. That's somebody with a good imagination. Even well-intentioned, sincere believers may scratch their heads sometime and say, you know, I don't quite get that. That does kind of read like fairy tale stuff. I don't know if I can actually believe that this literally happened. So let me give you some ways in which, or one simple way that you can accept what's going on here. And here's the answer. It's Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You know, we understand and logically can recognize the fact that things don't simply come into existence on their own. There has to be a cause. This world did not just appear. It has been caused. There is a creation which logically requires the existence of a creator. And with all of my heart, I would encourage you to accept with all of your heart what I believe is the only reasonable explanation to our existence and the existence of all that it is, of all that is, which again simply is that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And if God can, as He did, speak into the nothingness of existence, all that is, well, that God can make a fish swallow somebody and they live to tell. You get Genesis 1:1, you can accept Jonah 1:17. All right, so this great, enormous beast has swallowed Jonah, and he's in the belly of this fish. Now, you've got to recognize, though, that when the mariners, when the sailors threw Jonah into the sea, Jonah anticipated, well, this is going to be my grave. I'm going to die by drowning in this sea. Now he's been swallowed by this fish, and he's probably anticipating now, I will die by lethal digestion. That's how my end is going to come. And the words that he begins to utter in the form of a prayer to God starting in chapter 2, I really believe as he's talking to God, he's anticipating that these are probably the last words that he may ever speak. And so he says in verse 2, I cried out to the Lord because of my affliction. And then he says, out of the belly of Sheol I cried. Now, Sheol is a reference to the realm of the dead. Jonah is aware he's alive, but he's saying that I was in this realm of the dead. He was still alive, but was anticipating that death was imminent. He thought at some point this great fish is just going to go, and that was going to be it. One big swallow, and he was a goner. And so he is at this point expecting that death is going to come. And he says, I cried out to you, and you heard my voice. But verse 3 is interesting. Notice what he says, specifically the personal pronouns. He says to the Lord, he says, you cast me into the deep. Then he says, all your billows and your waves passed over me. Well, Jonah does not believe whatsoever that what he is experiencing is coincidence. It wasn't chance or coincidence that this storm almost broke up their boat so that the sailors tossed him into the sea. It wasn't by chance that he was in the sea, and it certainly wasn't by chance that he has been swallowed by this enormous beast. He recognized that all this has happened because God has been behind this. He doesn't say the waves tossed me around. He says these were your waves and your billows. You cast me into the deep. It wasn't these sailors. It wasn't these professional mariners. God, you are the one that did this. You say, well, Michael, I get that. That's pretty simple, but big deal. What does that have to do with me? Well, there is something very simple but very important in this. And here's the important truth. When God works through circumstance to get your attention, it's because you're not paying attention to Him. And He's at work and He's doing all kinds of stuff and you're not seeing it. You're not recognizing it. But when God works through circumstances to get your attention, once He finally wakes you up, at that point you're able to look back and say, this is what God was doing all the while. You're finally able to recognize through hindsight what God has been doing. You're able to see His fingerprints all over those circumstances and say, oh man, God brought that person into my life to say this because He was trying to wake me up. Or that this happened in terms of my job because God was trying to get my attention, to get me to the right place at the right time for this right opportunity He's now presenting. When God has your attention, when He's finally gotten it, when He has waken you up, like Jonah, you're able to look back and say, this wasn't chance. This wasn't coincidence. This happened because God was at work. He was trying to get my attention. He was at work all the while. Suppose tomorrow when you get to your desk at the office, there is, when you set your stuff down, you see that there's a bar of soap on your desk. And suppose for tomorrow you think, well, that's kind of strange. Somebody might have accidentally left this here. But on Tuesday, there's another bar of soap. And on Wednesday, there's another bar of soap. And for the next month, every day, there's a bottle or a bar of Dial soap on your desk. Well, at some point, you finally recognize this isn't chance, this isn't coincidence. Somebody is trying to get my attention and tell me I stink. I need a bath. Suppose tomorrow at school or suppose tomorrow at work that there's a good friend that you have, a coworker that you talk to on a regular basis throughout the day. And suppose every time they say something to you or you engage in conversation, they offer you a breath mint or they offer you a piece of gum. You know, at first you may think, well, okay, they're just being nice, they're just being generous, they're just trying to share with me. But when they've done that 3, 4, 5, 6 times throughout the day, every time you open their mouth, they say, would you like a breath mint? Finally, it's dawning on you, they're trying to get my attention and say that my breath smells like a dumpster. Suppose tomorrow at work or tomorrow at school, somebody that you're talking to, the conversation begins and they keep doing this to you. You know, at first you may think they might have a little itch, but when they when they continue doing that, at some point you're going to recognize, hey, they're trying to tell me I've got a dangling participle, right? Finally, it dawns on you, this isn't happening by chance. This isn't happening by coincidence. They're trying to get my attention. And once they finally have it, then you recognize all the while what they have been doing. Listen, God had been trying to work through Jonah's circumstances. He had first burdened him in his heart, and that didn't work. Jonah ignores that. When that didn't happen, God causes this storm to erupt, and Jonah is asleep in the boat. It's not getting his attention. God causes the storm to intensify to the point the ship is beginning to break up. The mariners think they're going to all drown. And finally, God has gotten Jonah's attention. Beyond that, he's been tossed into the seas in the belly of this great fish. Jonah finally says, okay, God, you got me. I can see now everything that you were doing. When God has your attention, the way that you can know it is that you realize what he's been doing. Things that thus far you had not been paying attention to, finally you can look back and say, that's what God has been doing all the while. Could it be that God has been trying to get your attention as of late? Perhaps it is that he's been using these messages even to try to shake you and to wake you up. Maybe it's a spouse or a child or a coworker or a fellow student. God has been trying to work through these individuals and through circumstances to get your attention. And perhaps until this very moment, the lights haven't gone off. But right now, all of a sudden, you're beginning to see, man, this isn't chance. This isn't coincidence. God was doing this. He, as Jonah says, he's cast me into the deep. These were his waves and his billows and his floods. God was and is at work. When he has your attention, you're able to see what he's been doing. But beyond that, you're able to recognize what God is seeking to do. You recognize what God is seeking to do when he has your attention. So Jonah is, as chapter 2 begins, he's in the belly of this fish. And you get a glimpse of how awful this is. He says, waters surround me. And verse 5, weeds wrapped around my head. He's got seaweed and all kinds of muck. There's the horrible sounds. I remember when I was little, I would go to sleep on my grandmother's lap in church, and I would hear her belly rumble. I can't imagine what it's like to be in the belly of this great fish. The sounds would have just been horrible. And besides that, fish stink when you're cooking them, and beyond that, you imagine what it's like, how horrible the smell is to be inside of one. Everything about this is absolutely terrible. And Jonah, though, is not complaining, even though it wasn't that he was in this fish for a few moments or even a few hours, rather for 3 days and 3 long nights, he is in the belly of this fish. In verse 4, he describes how distant he feels from the Lord. How it's though he feels as though he's been cast out of God's sight. He says, I have been cast out of your sight. But then he says this, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. Now, the exact meaning of what Jonah is saying to God, we can only speculate. But there's one thing that's very clear. While in the belly still of this great fish, he anticipated he was going to die in the ocean. Probably then anticipated he's going to die in the belly of this fish. But now all of a sudden, he's talking about the future, about things he is going to do. From a logical perspective, Jonah has every reason to believe that this is going to be the last prayer that he ever utters. At some point, this fish is its body is just going to consume and digest Jonah. But here he's talking about the future and says, yet I will again, that's future, I will look again to your holy temple. And so it seems that Jonah at this point is keenly aware of two things. First of all, he's aware that it has been God who was and is at work seeking to reclaim Jonah's attention. But the second thing that it seems is clear to Jonah is wonderfully positive, and here it is. Jonah recognizes God's not through with him yet. God's not through with me yet. I will do this. I will, future, look again towards your holy temple. What all that means, we're not sure, but we are keenly aware of the fact, Jonah is keenly aware of the fact, God's not done with me yet. There's still more that He wants me to do. Listen, that should come to you as a wonderful encouragement, because I want you to understand that when you and I disobey God, when we turn our backs on Him, when we stick our fingers in our ears and say, God, I'm not going to pay attention to you, I'm going to be like Frank Sinatra, I'm going to do things my way. When we do that, God is perfectly within His rights to zap us. And even if He doesn't zap us, He's perfectly within His rights to say, that's it, I'm through with them. I'm not going to do anything else with them. But the fact that God seeks to gain our attention, that He pursues us, is a reminder of this amazing, remarkable truth that God's a God of second chances, third chances, fourth chances. He comes to try to get our attention because He's trying to get us off the path that we're on, back on the path that leads to Him. And so when God has your attention, not only do you recognize what He's been doing, you recognize what He's seeking to do, which is to still use you. It was a couple of years ago, back when we were still in Charlotte. It was on a Sunday. After church, we'd gone to Caroline's parents for lunch. I don't know exactly when it was, but it was in the winter, because I remember after we had hung out there for a little bit, we'd gotten in the van and we were headed back to our house, and the heat was on. And when we got in the car, pretty quickly the kids go to sleep. I look over there and Caroline's drawing flies. She's sound asleep, and I'm beginning to think, I am so sleepy. My eyelids felt like they were 1,000 pounds, and my stomach was full. The sun is shining in on the driver's side. There's heat coming out of the floorboard. It is so warm, it's so toasty, it's so cozy, and I am so sleepy. Everybody in the van is asleep, and I pull up to an intersection. I've got my foot on the brake, and my eyes are just like this. And in the quiet of that moment, in the stillness of that moment, in the comfort of that moment, I go to sleep. Sitting in an intersection, my foot still on the brake, car still in gear, I go sound asleep. I look like some of y'all this morning. And so I am absolutely dead to the world, sitting there at this red light. And all of a sudden, I wake up to the sound of horns blowing. And of course, Caroline hears this, and she said, were you asleep? And so at this point, I'm just gunning it, because everybody in the lanes beside me, they've already taken off. People behind me, they're ready for me to get out of the way. All right, so they have blown the horn, and that has gotten my attention. Now, let me ask you this. Why were they seeking to get my attention? Is it because they were wanting me to turn the ignition off, put the car in park, get out of the vehicle, and just surrender my license? Is that what they were trying to get me to do? Were they trying to get me just to stop there and say, you know what, I'm just too sleepy. I need to have this vehicle towed, and we're just going to walk home? Is that what they were trying to do? No, they were honking the horn. They were blowing the horn because they're trying to get me to be doing what I should have been doing all the while. Listen, that's exactly what God does when He seeks to get your attention. God worked through these circumstances, through this terrible storm, through this enormous beast, through the fear, through the terror, through the awful stench, the sounds, all of this. God worked through this to get Jonah's attention, not so that He could say, I'm done with you, not so that He could say, I'm setting you on the shelf, that's it, we're through. Rather, to get Jonah to be doing what he should have been doing all the while, to get him to go back to Nineveh, to get him to preach, to share the word that God originally intended for him to do. And when God has your attention, you see that. You recognize He's been at work trying to get my attention. I didn't see it at first, but I see it now. And finally, when He has it, you recognize, man, He's been doing this because He's not through with me. That ought to put a smile on your face. It ought to bring encouragement to your heart. But then it ought to lead you to do one more thing, which is clear evidence that God has your attention, which is this. You renew your commitment to the Lord. You renew your commitment to the Lord. All right, so Jonah has finally woken up. God's got his attention in ways perhaps he has never had it before. And he had been on this ship, and we looked at this last week in chapter 1. And when the storm was so bad and these mariners, these professional sailors were so frightened, they weren't followers of God. They were people that worshiped idols and false gods and pagan deities. And Jonah says at this point in verse 8, those who regard worthless idols, they forsake their own mercy. And he's saying, you know what? There are people that put their trust and their hope for salvation in things that have been made or things that are simply not real. And in doing so, they are forsaking the mercy that could be theirs. But then he says in verse 9, I will sacrifice to you with the voice of thanksgiving. I will pay what I have vowed. Salvation is of the Lord. What's interesting, and if you remember back from chapter 1, remember these sailors, they're not followers of God. They're worshiping idols, false gods, pagan deities. But you remember, as God has worked through that storm, he's gotten their attention. When Jonah is thrown into the sea calms, he has their attention. And if you go back to the end of verse 1, or excuse me, of chapter 6, verse 16 of chapter 1, we're told these men feared the Lord exceedingly, offered a sacrifice to the Lord, and took vows. And so what has happened to them, it seems now, is occurring for Jonah. Again, he says, I'm going to sacrifice to you. I will pay what I have vowed. Salvation is of the Lord. Now, this whole idea of what Jonah had vowed, we don't know. All we have are his statements here. God knew his heart, knew exactly what it was that Jonah had said to God that he was going to do. But ultimately, I believe in essence what he is saying is this: God, you have my attention. I have learned clearly now some lessons, and I'm going to get back to doing what I should have been all along. Perhaps it is that God is trying to accomplish the same thing in your life. Maybe through trouble in relationships, marital relationships, family relationships. Maybe in difficulty at work between you and the boss or a coworker. Maybe with difficulty in finances, or maybe it is even health and physical challenges. God has been working to get your attention. And finally, when He has it, when He has helped you to see where you are, but more importantly, where He wants you to be, you say, all right, God, you've got my attention. I'm going to commit myself now to do that. What you've been wanting me to do, God, I want to do this now. That's what Jonah's doing. He is renewing, he's refreshing his commitment to the Lord. In the life of one whose faith is in God, when you wander from Him, He is absolutely going to seek to gain your attention, and you will know that He's gotten it when you decide and when you say to Him, you believe, you feel this in your heart, God, I am ready now to do what it is that you want me to do. A week ago this past Saturday, Caroline that morning had suggested that I go get some donuts. It had been months since we had had any, and so she said the kids they'd enjoy those, and so I said, okay, wonderful idea. I go to Krispy Kreme. I get a dozen glazed and a dozen chocolate iced donuts. I come back, and we get the boys situated. They get their donut. And then Catherine, though, who turned 1 this past Monday, we give to her her first donut, a chocolate iced Krispy Kreme donut. And she'd never had anything like this, but I'm telling you, Catherine loved this donut. In fact, she not only loved that donut, she loved the second one that she ate that morning. And so the kids have this great time. She makes this horrible mess, but she loves every bit of this. And so that was on Saturday. And out of these 24 donuts, there were still donuts that were left on Sunday morning. Well, on Sunday morning, what we do is we get up, we get everybody showered and dressed. When I get dressed, I leave. I come on over to the church. I'm here typically by 7:30. Caroline is still at the house with the kids. She's getting breakfast for them, and then they come a little bit later. And so they had not eaten breakfast when I left. Well, that Sunday morning last week, Caroline is giving to Catherine oatmeal. And Catherine loves oatmeal. And most mornings she eats that for breakfast, and she loves it. Last Sunday, she has almost finished her bowl of oatmeal. There's 2 or 3 bites left. Caroline has just put a spoonful of oatmeal into Catherine's mouth. She has this oatmeal in her mouth when Big Phil walks in with a donut and sets it onto Catherine's tray. Now, when Catherine sees this donut, it's clear that it caught her attention. Because at that point, the oatmeal that's in her mouth, she looks down, she spits it into her bib, she wipes her mouth with her sleeve, and then she grabs that donut. how do we know that that donut got her attention? I'll tell you. It's because of what she did. It's what she did that communicated that it had her attention. We've been talking about how you can tell whether God has your attention or not, whether it is that you are paying attention to Him. The ultimate test is this: it is what you do. Your actions, your obedience to Him demonstrates your attentiveness to Him. If that is true, and it is, I have a simple question for you today. Your actions and what you do, your obedience, or perhaps your lack of it, to what degree does that say that you are paying attention to God? What you do demonstrates your attentiveness to Him. What you are doing, what does it say about how you are paying attention to God? Won't you bow your heads with me?